Yes, Mark Vicente went on to be the right-hand man of Keith Raniere in Nxivm, and it is one of my favorite facts. Thank you, Inky Spitfire, for bringing it up. Let's get into it. So, Mark Vicente is a filmmaker who made the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And I mentioned that movie in the video that I made yesterday about the invisible ships myth and how that myth is both untrue, harmful, and also racist. And I think What the Bleep Do We Know? It is a, besides being a terrible film, it is a harmful film. But it was somewhat popular in the early aughts in spiritual circles. Not in wide release, but amongst the woo-woo, it made the rounds. And it meant that Mark Vicente had a little bit of a name for himself. And so he was recruited by Keith Raniere because Keith Raniere was like, here's someone who has a little bit of a name in the circles that I'm trying to infiltrate. And sadly, I feel like Mark Vicente is someone who was primed because he was clearly a lover of pseudoscience, which is what the bleep do we know was selling. Because he's this lover of pseudoscience, he was definitely primed to be targeted by Keith Raniere's whole spiel, because what Keith Raniere was selling was this idea that he had developed a technology that was going to help people improve themselves and become essentially it's not convincing and it doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's this idea that this technology is going to make people better and therefore that's going to make the world better, right? And so I mentioned this in a video that I made a few months ago about my top 10 cult documentaries, because I have seen more than 10, and so I have a top 10. I'm obsessed with cults, so I was following the Nxivm story kind of the whole way through. And in that top 10, I do mention two different documentaries on the Nxivm cult. The documentary Seduced, and then the documentary from HBO, The Vow, which is the one that Mark Vicente was instrumental in getting produced. And I mentioned that I prefer Seduced because I think the point of view is much more victim focused, and in the Vow, in the Mark Vicente space, it's much more about the egos of the people at the top of Nxivm. It honestly is. And I sympathize for them and I think it's compelling. I think it's really interesting, but there's a few sequences in there where you're like, this was Mark Vicente had a hand in this. This is. And there's a moment in the Vow documentary where he's talking with Sarah Edmonds' husband, Nippy, and asking him if he ever misses being a part of the cult and working towards something. And Nippy's like, no, man, I don't. And you're just kind of like, yeah, that tracks. I bet he does miss that. And in the documentary The Vow, you see this toxic enmeshment that Mark Vicente has with Keith Raniere, and you see this chumminess and this pet names and this together all the time, and just the constant filming everything, filming him playing volleyball. It's so messed up. But then at the same time, so you see Mark Vicente being manipulated, but at the same time, you also know that by the end of his time in the cult, he's gotten involved in sort of the men's group at Nxivm, and his wife is involved in the women's group. not the one where they branded everybody, but the one was slightly more public than that. Because the branding one was the secret one, but there was a more public women's group. But even in the more public women's group, it was all about how men needed to be dominant and women needed to be submissive. And so by the end of Mark Vicente's time in that cult, he had his wife sleeping on the floor. She had to sleep on the floor as punishment for not being perfectly submissive. Like, and I don't think she was being punished by Mark Vicente. I think she was being punished by Keith or by the system, whatever, but still, like, your partner is still sleeping on the floor. So yeah, Mark Vicente is a fascinating character. To see his arc in the spiritual world go from the poster child of pseudoscience with his first documentary film making a splash in those circles, and then him going all the way to being at the very top of one of the most notorious cults in United States history. Like, it's kind of juicy and I kind of love it. And yeah, I'm fascinated to see where he goes after this.